Welcome to episode 17. In this episode, we are going to create a validation for the transaction date. This task is basically ensuring that we enter the correct transaction date. So let's say if I enter some weird stuff in the transaction date, I expect to get a warning. I have to enter strictly according to the format. So I put a string and a date backslash and then the month in double digit and then a 4-digit year. Okay. Let's say if I don't enter an invoice and enter a date, so I expect to get a warning message also, so that we won't run into a problem with the wrong date. Okay, we can simply create a column called transaction days value. So we need the trans date value, which is similar to this one. So before we move on, let me just enter a dummy transaction date first. Following the format, date, month, and then year. 10 July 2018. For the transaction date value column, I'm getting a little lazy here because I can simply Ctrl+C, Ctrl+V to paste whatever report start or end date value, and I paste as the formula. We only need to change one thing. It is this one. We only need to replace the set start date with the transaction date. So we move to the transaction date so that you will see the @ sign. Remember this one because we only select the concurrent row of the transaction date. So basically what we need to do is replacing all this with the transaction date. So just copy that because we already create a format right at the beginning. You can check the video. I think it should be in the first 3 episodes. Should be fine. Ctrl+V. So let me press enter and see what we get. So we have 2 days rate, but we have a whole bunch of error value. So to get rid of that, very simple, we go back to the first cell of the column. Just go this way, Ctrl+N, Ctrl+X to copy that, and add if error. For the value, I Ctrl+V to paste that, and then comma. When you see the value if error, press Alt-Enter, and then I just put 0, close the bracket. Then I press Enter, then you will see I get rid of all the 0. After we create the transaction value, we can move on to create the transaction date validation column, which is trans date valid. Okay, let me make it a little bit bigger. Okay, remember the underscore. For the transaction date validation, we are going to create a condition. So we use equal. Actually, we have 2 conditions. So I put an and first, and I put a comma to separate the first condition and the second condition. Okay, the first condition holds when the transaction num equals 1. That means we are valid to enter an invoice. So after we enter an invoice number or bank transaction number, we have to insert the date, right? So the first condition holds, and the second condition is a little bit complicated. So I put it after the comma. Let me go here. The second condition is wrapped around in an OR formula. And the first condition is, okay, we have to make sure when the transaction date column is blank, like this one, then you can enter. Let me just click the transaction date, add the formula is blank, and then I wrap around the transaction date. The second condition inside the OR condition is this one, the transaction date value that we just create. The transaction date value has to be not equal to 0. Okay, so that means when you enter a valid date following the correct format, your transaction date value won't be 0. Okay, so after that, let me check if this one is an and. So before we move on, let me press enter first. So I should expect a whole bunch of true and false, right? But we want 1 to represent true and 0 to represent false, so that we can use the transaction date validation column for our transaction date validation. So let me follow this way. Highlight this, Ctrl+X, and then I put if, open bracket, and then Ctrl+V. If this condition holds, comma, Alt-Enter, we put 1. If the above long statement is true, we return 1. Otherwise, comma, we return 0. It's false. Okay? Close the bracket, Enter. So that whenever we see 1, we can enter the transaction date. Whenever we have 0, we can enter. Okay? So we go to the transaction date column. We select the first cell of the transaction date and then we press Alt-DL. Okay, to bring up the data validation. Then we just allow custom. We left click the formula and then we move over to the first cell of the transaction date valid cell. Simply equals 1 because whenever this column equals 1, we can enter the transaction date. So after that, we select the first cell and Ctrl+C, press Shift and down arrows all the way down to the last row so that you can select the whole column and then you right click and paste special. Take the validation and then press OK. Now we can check our validation. Let me press escape, type whatever wrong format. Then I should expect an error message. I'm not supposed to enter a date here, right? Because I haven't entered the transaction reference. Let me see if I can still enter a date. Try typing 12 July 2019. We can't enter a date. That means our validation works. Okay. So for the next video, I'll continue working on the bookkeeping interface. Thank you. Bye bye.